rights in Ireland. And we particularly wanted this session because we wanted to have this focus on issues within Ireland for this summer school as well. So we've got two fantastic speakers here this afternoon, and the reason they have been invited is because, not just because of the content of their research, but also because of the methodology that they have used. So we have Yomi Ogunsanya here. Yomi, if you want to turn on your camera there as well, hopefully you can hear us. I know you've been in there. You are great, thank you. And we have Carol Ballantine. Hi. So for this afternoon, what we'll do is I'll introduce both speakers, and they will have about 15 minutes to give their presentations. I will, unfortunately, I will interrupt you at the 3-minute mark to give you a forewarning, if that's okay. And then we will have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So we'll start with Dr. Yomi Ogunsanya, who holds a degree in anthropology from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and he has taught courses in anthropology and sociology in the Department of Sociology in Osun State University in Nigeria. And then in 2018, Dr. Ogunsanya moved to Ireland with his family and experienced direct provision firsthand. And he used this experience to conduct his autoethnographic research within direct provision, and he has delivered lectures on aspects of this research and on his experience of direct provision system at various fora, including most recently at the Ethnography Winter School in the Department of Anthropology in Maynooth University. And Dr. Ogunsanya is currently a member of the European Association of Social Anthropologists, the 2022 Scientific Committee. So, Yomi, you're very welcome this afternoon. And then after Yomi speaks, we will have Dr. Carol Ballantine, who completed her PhD in 2020 on narratives of violence in the lives of African migrant women in Ireland. And she currently works as a postdoctoral researcher investigating social polarization relating to gender, sexuality, and reproductive rights. So Carol and Yomi, you're both very welcome. So Yomi, if we start with you, if that's okay, if you'd like to share your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I hope I'm audible enough.
You are, yeah, it's perfect.
Thank you very much. As you've been told, this presentation is from a book I have written about my experience living in direct provision here in Ireland. It's not officially out yet, but hopefully it will be out sometime later this year. But I have chosen to take aspects of it as my focus in this lecture. And in large part, I'll be speaking about issues of methodology and so on, but also about some of my findings, my little discussion about some of the things that some of them are pretty well known, about what goes on in direct provision, but I'm not going to assume that everyone knows this because I have been startled by the kinds of questions people have asked, including people who were born and raised in Ireland asking me, what's direct provision? Is there any such thing in Ireland? So I'm not going to take it for granted that you all know what it means or what really goes on there. So I have this slide that I would share with you just to guide our discussion, and hopefully I can do it in 15 minutes. Thank you. So I will put it slideshow. Yep, here we go. So I've titled the presentation Lives in Limbo Towards an Anthropology of Direct Provision System in Ireland. I have chosen this title because what I have tried to do in the book that I have written is to propose what I have called anthropology of direct provision. And this is for two reasons. One, because I am by training an anthropologist, and more importantly, the existing studies of direct provision um, are not, I have not seen any that is by a trained anthropologist or that is directly or crucially related to anthropology. So I think that there is a gap there that this book might be filling, you know. So like most ethnographers, I did not set out on an ethnographic inquiry at all. But like Robert Murphy, whose book gave me the inspiration for my own study. I found myself on a journey that was set in motion by an unfortunate concatenation of events that threatened my life and those of my family. The journey has been both literal and figurative, a journey into the remote experiences of asylum seekers living in direct provision in Ireland. Now, I regard my experience as an international protection applicant living in direct provision at the time as an extended anthropological field trip. Now, the stories and vignettes I'll be telling you form part of my report of that travel. Now, for those who are probably not familiar with Robert Murphy was an anthropologist in Columbia University, and sometime in his life he became disabled, and then he found that the occasion provided an opportunity for him to propose some kind of an anthropology of disability, writing about his experience as someone who who at that time had recently joined a community, a community of disabled people. And the book filled a very important gap, on the literature of disability. So I started from, let's say a bit about methodology. Now, asylum seekers are not, of course, terra incognita as far as research is concerned. They constitute an epistemic site, just like any other sociocultural entity, and have thus attracted significant scholarly attention, including in Irish academia and industry. And so has direct provision system, which has now spanned 20 years since its adoption. Albeit, no study, as I said earlier, to my mind, has ever been done from the perspective of anthropology and by a trained ethnographer on the social circumstances of asylum seekers living in direct provision and the wider implications of this condition to matters of social justice and human rights in Ireland. That undertaking seems to have fallen on me. My work, as I said, draws its primary inspiration from Robert Murphy's anthropological investigation into the world of the disabled. The Body Silent was conceived more or less as a serendipitous discovery, like mine too. Now, I found that in trying to engage with my condition as an inmate of Ireland's direct provision, in thinking about methodology, in thinking about how best, to report what I have found, that it was important that I adopted what in anthropology we call critical ethnography, and this is because critical ethnography, is very suitable to any kind of study that is interested in bringing to the fore, to the attention of people, what is usually hidden from view. Usually critical anthropology deals with issues of power, especially in contexts where the community is deemed to be marginal to the mainstream. Now, I adopted, and in doing this, of course, I adopted an autoethnographic approach in detailing aspects of life and living in direct provision. Now, I am not just a participant observer, I'm also self-reflexively embedded in the research. Now, further, my work is conceived as as I said, as a critical ethnography, a process that allows the contributions of less visible actors, and there are quite a number of them in direct provision. When you look at the literature on direct provision, a lot of what you hear, what you see, of the voice you hear is usually of someone telling you what happens there, not of people there themselves telling you what they're really going through, you know. So I see critical ethnography being able to address what I see as a problem in this regard. So a process that allows the contributions of less visible actors, that is the people directly impacted by the system, to become more apparent. I find this to be appropriate because the critical lens of critical ethnography disrupts the tendency to objectify, and we find a lot of these on studies of people in direct provision. They are objectified, you know, because they are a silent group. Now, excuse me. Oh, which have been historically, and these are people who have been historically misrepresented through journalistic and academic inquiries. And I'll give you one example. I recall, I think a couple of years ago, or maybe about a year ago, a certain Irish politician saying that, oh, all those immigrants and the people in direct provision are here to sponge off the system. You know, now, there's an aspect of my work where I have directly responded to this, you know, brought out the fallacy of that kind of pronouncement. But we see also a lot of this in other kinds of, I mean, in a lot of journalistic writings. Recently, I think a few days ago, there was something that was a very controversial thing that was said by, I think, David Quinn, you know, who writes for I think he writes for the Irish Times and one other magazine, talking about, you know, where he says this very controversial thing about the disproportionate treatment of Ukrainian refugees, you know, uh, compared to how other nationals that have come to Ireland to seek, or to other places to seek asylum. But that's not, you know, the canon of my my talk. You know, we may be able to come back to that hopefully during question and answer. So finally, critical ethnography will expose the limited framing of the social conditions of people in direct provision. Now, there is also an important aspect that that my work has also tried to address, and this is some kind of a reaction to what Vivek Shraver says. You know, she says, "Why is my humanity only seen or cared about when I share the ways in which I have been victimized and violated?" But unlike Asha Walia, who in her book Border and Rule bluntly refuses anthropological consumption. She sees, you know, this kind of, when I share my story, you know, and so on and so forth, as some kind of anthropological consumption. She sees it, bluntly refuses, you know, what that kind of direction, you know, as a response to this important question. Now, I realized that as an anthropologist, I am duty bound to share my experience, if perhaps in the established tradition of autoethnography. This is because I speak, if you would pardon the conceit, for a subaltern community, a community that is at the margin of society. Now, there are, of course, when you choose to speak for that kind of community, a lot of concerns about methodology. So conducting ethnography in direct provision setting as an inmate, and that's the word, unfortunately, conducting ethnography in direct provision setting as an inmate provided an opportunity for a deep immersion in a world that is often rendered invisible to the mainstream. But it also raised important questions about the ethnographer's shifting roles between being a researcher and being a member of the community. These questions are similar to those that are raised with regard to the practice of conducting ethnographic fieldwork at home, a situation that challenges understandings of value and legitimacy in academic research, since objectivity might be seen to be compromised or threatened, or one might be charged with cultural blindness. And I have had people ask that kind of question of me, how can I be sure that you're not being blinded by the way you've been treated in writing and saying some of the things you have written or are saying, but even beyond that, there is also.
Sorry, we're just at the 3-minute mark now.
Okay, out, just in 3 minutes, I think. Then there's also the question of my own subjectivity as an ethnographer in the course of carrying out the research. There were times when, as someone who, who has a PhD in anthropology and so on, and you're dealing with some other people who probably are not that educated, and then they look at you and think, okay, there's some kind of power play going on here. We would hopefully be able to talk a bit more about this in the course of question and answer. And then finally, there was in the course, there was in the course of carrying out the research, at some point there was need to rethink my methodology, and that was in the light of COVID-19. The ethnography was conceived and began before the COVID-19 pandemic began, and it's continued into the pandemic years. Now, during that time, spaces of social intercourse with fellow residents of the research site became further shrunken, and the lived experience of a pervasive sense of vulnerability, anxiety, hope, and possibility that had always characterized life in direct provision became heightened. Now, rethinking the methodologies of engagement through use of available media infrastructure became necessary. And I hopefully will be able to talk about how this was done in the course of question and answer. Thank you very much for your attention and for this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Yomi, and apologies if that was quite short. I know there's a lot of depth and insight into your research, and your point around making the visible or making the invisible visible is really strong and really pertinent, and hopefully we can explore it a little bit more during the Q&A. So we'll move on now to Dr. Carol Ballantine, and then after that we'll have time for Q&A. Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Carol. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
And you can see my slides as well?
I can, but it's in the notes format.
Oh, darn it.
If you don't have notes, or if you're happy to share the notes, it's fine.
Yeah, that might be easiest, because what I'm seeing is quite different then. Sorry. Okay, if you don't mind me rocking on then. This paper is based on an article I published in Violence Against Women journal. So there is a longer paper available for anybody who's motivated to have a look at it. I'm happy to share it. But what I'm going to do in this paper is talk briefly about what I tried to do with my PhD research, or with the qualitative leg of it, and really, what I was trying to do and how I went about it. So I won't get into the details of the discussion today, but invite you to maybe follow up with me or look it up. Okay, so I think Yomi's talk sets up exactly the challenge that I confronted in my PhD research, and that really is that challenge of the term I hadn't heard before of anthropological consumption, of how we carry out research with people without othering them. And this was particularly interesting to me in a book by a sociology professor who I really love, Imogen Tyler. And she writes in her book, Stigma, the Machinery of Inequality, about her own experience when she was a young working class woman, the first in her generation to go to university, and she encountered anthropologists sharing their fieldwork through a slideshow. And she met an anthropologist who, when she heard the name of the small Lancashire village where Imogen Tyler herself had grown up, said, "Oh, I don't believe it. My PhD supervisor did his fieldwork there." So in the book, Tyler just goes on to describe her dreams that night, in which she and her community are projected on the anthropologist's wall. She says, the dinner guests don't recognize that I am in the images. They talk about the culture of the rural community. They share comments, offer analysis, make judgments. It's impossible for them to imagine that the object of the fieldwork might be right there with them in the room and on the wall at the same time, served up on the wall to be consumed at an academic dinner party. I shrink into the chair. I make myself as small as possible. I want to disappear. I am overwhelmed with shame. I radiate shame. So my research was looking at narratives of violence in the lives of African women living in Ireland. And I had a particular interest in stigma and what stigma does to our experiences of violence. And stigma poses particular methodological challenges for researchers. It poses that ethical challenge of othering others and imposing shame on them. And it also imposes an epistemological challenge. When we create that sense of shame and otherness, it becomes harder to understand and to hear. So a potential counterpart to stigma in researching these sorts of issues is narrative inquiry. So narrative is both a way of doing research, a type of method, and also a way of thinking about research data. Narrative inquiry is concerned with meaning making at the human level. A narrative ultimately is an individual or a community's way of describing something, their own account of something. Hannah Arendt famously stated that narrative reveals the meaning without committing the error of defining it. And this was really, really important to me in creating a space where research participants could be truthful and could explore things without getting pinned down. Stigma reduces and essentializes flat people into flat categories: women, survivors, victims, refugees, migrants. Narrative offers to restore agency and uniqueness. So that's where I was coming from with taking a narrative approach to the qualitative part of my research. So my PhD is a mixed method study. I also carried out key informant interviews and policy analysis, but the heart of it was this qualitative research with African women living in Ireland. Many of those had experience of the international protection system and the refugees, the direct provision system. Some of them were in direct provision at the time of the research, and some were not. Some had different personal migration backgrounds. The basic structure of this part of the study was I carried out 6 participatory focus group discussions with groups of African women who were friendly, who knew each other, where there was kind of trust and confidence to speak together. And out of those focus groups then, I invited people who had a personal, individual experience of violence to take part in a more in-depth interview. And narrative really infused my approach to all of this study. So I'm going to just demonstrate a couple of ways in which I used narrative to frame the way that I carried out the research. So with the focus groups, it was a kind of instruction to participants in the focus groups that they should not disclose their own personal experiences of violence, or rather that they, they were encouraged to speak in the third person and in more abstract terms, since it's quite an exposing thing to share your own experience, and there really isn't any way of guaranteeing confidentiality in a group of people that you can't control. So very little disclosure occurred within the focus groups, although they were very trusting spaces, and it did happen at least once. But what people did was, through the use of pictures and various participatory research activities, people really, really became involved in creating third-person stories. And I could see that they were kind of assembling a bricolage from sometimes famous stories. Tina Turner came up, Michelle Obama came up, sometimes things that had happened that were known to them collectively, you know, kind of outrages that had occurred locally in Irish villages and towns, and sometimes things that, you know, had happened to people that they knew, or potentially to themselves. And these pictures in this slide and the next one are from a validation exercise that I carried out, where I invited participants to come back when I was conducting my analysis, to kind of tell them, these are the themes I'm identifying, how do you feel about them? I pulled out my same materials, these kind of movable pictures and dolls, at the very beginning of the workshop. And before I had given anybody any instructions, they had started sorting through my images, seizing on ones that they liked, and narrating stories around them. So there was something really, really engaging and energizing about the invitation to tell stories with a really, really simple opening, like migration and violence. And those were really the themes that I invited people to narrate around, and it was incredibly rich. When it came to individual interviews, I conducted long, semi-structured narrative interviews where I allowed the participant to steer the interview herself. And then subsequently what I did was met with the participant again and kind of assembled my interpretation of her story, or the narrative that I had picked up, and fed it back to her. And this image shows a kind of picture of how I worked with images and kind of graphics and quotes from the interview itself. And the idea of this is that one of the strengths of narrative, particularly when researching topics related to trauma, is that if you think about a refugee's experience in particular, they're constantly required to tell their story for the purposes of accessing services or of asserting their claim to international protection, but it's constantly taken away from them. And my effort was, and again, this can be problematized in many ways and valuably, but I was trying to return the control of the story as much as possible and at every stage possible to the individual. And at the end of the research, I was very fortunate, and this was a kind of a happenstance in a way. I said to a friend of mine who's an artist, I'm going to return the interview transcripts to my research participants. Can you think of any way to do this? That would be nice. That was really what I said. And she said, well, I'm a printmaker. I'll make books for you. And so I had this opportunity to type up very carefully the transcripts of each individual story to the 5 people who gave in-depth interviews and return them to them in these handmade books. I don't know if you can see, she made a 6th one just for me. So this is my copy, and it is all the interviews transcribed. And the effort in doing this was really, again, to endorse the effort that participants had made to put a structure and a shape on their story, and to encourage them to value their story, and to encourage them to continue to explore it, and play with what happens when they narrate. And so
3 minutes.
Super, I'm just wrapping up. This is a quote from the interview from one participant, which I pulled out, and she said in the course of her interview, it's not easy, you know, to talk about such things, but then it also gave me power. Yeah, it also gave me power, and also shows me that I did not deserve all this, you know, what I went through. So the process of the research encounter is a process of the participant making sense, and I wanted to materialize that and give it back to them. So in my article, I discussed the various aspects of this, but I suppose the one that I would draw attention to is that even though I was doing these various things to try to restore the ownership of story to the research participants, and to really give space to their own process of meaning making, the reality is that stigma threads through all interpersonal exchanges. And there's no such thing as a narrative that's wholly owned by one participant in an encounter. These are always co-constructing spaces. So I was transparent about my presence and my impact on the research and the narrative process, but I wasn't able to remove it. And so in certain ways, you can see even these narratives recasting and reinforcing many stigmatizing structures and stigmatizing stories which are themselves troubling and recreated in the research space. So that's the end. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Carol. Yeah, perfectly timed, both of you. So thank you very much for your in-depth presentations. And I'm sorry that we don't have much time to really go into delve into the actual content of your research in the detail that it deserves. But I think the kind of the themes from both of your presentations there this afternoon are really highlighting issues of otherness, of stigma, of invisibility, and how these can be challenged by the methodologies that we use to conduct research. So whether that's ethnography, whether it's the use of narratives, but within that really understanding who controls the story and who has the power, and how the process of the research encounter can either challenge or enhance that, depending on what we do with it. So thank you to both of you for those insights. I'd like to open to any questions then for both Yomi and for Carol. So feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand. And yeah, happy to moderate it. Coming to the end of the day and people are a little tired. I know it's been a long day. So Catherine.
Hi, I just had, a question that I thought was, extraordinary, because Carol, in your presentation, you said the women gave accounts of both Tina Turner and Michelle Obama. Now, I think we all know what happened to Tina Turner at the hands of Ike Turner, I presume is what we're talking about, yeah? Her partner. But Michelle Obama experiencing violence? Did I pick that up wrong? I did.
In short, yes. I suppose I'm just saying that kind of people pull on all sorts of resources. So yeah, Michelle Obama was kind of a reference, a bit like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who came up as well, of kind of a sort of a vision, if you like, of what people aspired to, or what people hoped for in their lives, which was also part of what I invited people to talk about. And then Tina Turner, as you say. But again, kind of as an example, not of violence as much as an example of overcoming, and that was one of the very strongest themes, and maybe one of the themes I struggled with, because I felt that was a really constraining narrative, that things had to be framed frequently in terms of overcoming, and it was very, very difficult to give people space to talk about just struggling. But so people drew on those resources of success stories very frequently, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? I have a question for Yomi, if that's okay. Maybe if it'd be great if you could just tell us a little bit more around so I know you mentioned at the beginning there the book that you're currently writing. If you'd like to give us a little bit more insight then into where maybe you see that going, or the use that might have in terms of challenging issues within the direct provision system at the moment. It's a big question, sorry.
Oh yeah, it's big. Well, I think what was uppermost on my mind at the time I conceived the idea for the book was simply to tell stories about what's going on, especially about things that are little less talked about. And in this regard, I am more interested in talking about how people overcome the precarity that is the direct provision system, how they overcome it and how they transform it. You know, very often other research have been about the impact of the structure on the agency of the people. But what about the impact of the agency on the structure itself? You know, how, for example, do people overcome issues of discrimination within the direct provision system itself? You know, and I'm not talking about direct provision writ large. I'm talking about right within each individual centers. You know, how do they overcome issues that are very familiar in nature? You know, then issues about the arrangement of living spaces. You know, beyond simply saying that, oh, they are always packing their bags, always and here I'm alluding to one of the studies that I'm familiar with, you know, that simply glows over how, for instance, the living spaces are arranged and so on. But what about looking at this in terms of the cultural backgrounds of the people living within those spaces, you know? And I try to look at the kinds of arrangements, the kind of compromises that people, for instance, would have to make with fellow inmates, you know, of, say, rooms, you know, and the kinds of arrangements they also have to make in terms of the kinds of food they eat outside, what is available to them within the centers and all that, you know. So I have tried to give attention to things like that in individual chapters, you know, mindful that it will not do to tell people what they already know. You know, it's more important to tell them what is often invisible to them, you know. But more importantly, it is also not okay that's my view, you know, to exoticize uh, some of these experiences, which leads to anthropological consumption in the first place. You know, that people live in direct provision does not mean that they are not human beings or that they are not creating alternative realities and lives for themselves. You know, what about the issue of placemaking, for instance? Does that stop because you are living in direct provision? No, it doesn't. People find other ways of doing placemaking, for instance. So I have chapters that address things like that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what you've touched on there, I think is going to make a really important contribution to our where you said, you know, at the beginning that a lot of people in Ireland still don't know what direct provision is. So I think your contribution will make hopefully an important change for many of us. So thank you. I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of the day, so I will close off now and hand back to Catherine. So Yomi and Carol, thank you so much for your time and for your contribution and your work, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, everybody.